The morning sun filtered through the tall, grimy windows of the small-town courthouse, casting long shadows across the worn wooden benches. The air was thick with the murmur of whispered conversations and the occasional rustle of papers. In the center of it all sat Judge Richard Hawthorne, a man whose reputation preceded him, known for his biting wit and disdain for anyone he considered beneath his intellectual level. Hawthorne ruled his courtroom with an iron fist wrapped in sarcasm. His piercing gaze swept over the room, landing finally on the next person scheduled to appear before him, a woman who looked entirely out of place. Clara Bennett stood at the edge of the gallery, clutching a tattered notebook to her chest. Her clothes were simple, almost plain, and her hands trembled slightly as she approached the podium. She didn't look like someone ready to take on a legal battle, let alone one against a powerful real estate developer. Yet there she was, stepping forward with quiet determination etched into her face. The bailiff called her name and she moved toward the stand, her footsteps slow but steady. Judge Hawthorne leaned back in his chair, studying her with obvious skepticism. "Miss Bennett," he began, his voice dripping with condescension. Do you have any idea what you're doing here? This isn't exactly a place for amateurs." He paused, letting his words sink in, clearly enjoying the discomfort they caused. Clara blinked but said nothing, her fingers tightening around the edges of her notebook. Hawthorne pressed on, his tone growing sharper. "You're representing yourself, I assume? Against one of the largest developers in the state? Tell me, Ms. Bennett, do you even know how court proceedings work?" He smirked, glancing briefly at the spectators seated behind her. A few chuckled nervously, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Clara's silence only seemed to fuel his mockery. "Let me guess, you've been watching too many courtroom dramas on television?" Despite his cutting remarks, Clara remained still, her expression unreadable. There was something about her demeanor that made people pause. It wasn't defiance or anger. It was calmness, almost as if she had anticipated this moment and was prepared for it. But Judge Hawthorne didn't notice. To him, she was just another unprepared defendant, easy prey for his sharp tongue. As the minutes ticked by, the judge continued his tirade, peppering Clara with questions designed to embarrass her further. "Do you have any evidence to support your claims?" he asked, leaning forward now, his elbows resting on the bench. "Or are we just going to rely on intuition?" His lips curled into a sneer, and several members of the audience exchanged uneasy glances. Even the opposing counsel, a slick lawyer representing the developer, seemed uncomfortable with the spectacle unfolding before them. But Clara didn't flinch. Instead, she opened her notebook slowly, revealing pages filled with neat handwriting and meticulously organized notes. For a brief moment, her eyes met the judge's, and though she didn't say a word, there was a flicker of something in her gaze, confidence perhaps, or maybe resolve. Whatever it was, it caught Judge Hawthorne off guard, though he quickly masked his surprise with another jab. "You know," he said, tapping his gavel lightly against the bench, "most people hire lawyers for cases like this. Not everyone can be a hero, Ms. Bennett." His voice carried an edge of mockery, but Clara simply nodded, as if acknowledging his point without agreeing. Then, with deliberate care, she reached into her bag and pulled out a stack of documents bound together with a rubber band. Placing them on the table in front of her, she finally spoke. "Your Honor," she began, her voice soft but steady. "I may not have a law degree hanging on my wall anymore, but I understand the law well enough to know when someone is trying to trample on my rights and the rights of others." Her words hung in the air, drawing a collective intake of breath from the crowd. Even Judge Hawthorne raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite himself. What followed was a tense exchange, with the judge probing further, attempting to trip her up with technical jargon and procedural loopholes. But Clara held her ground, responding to each question with surprising poise. At one point, when Hawthorne demanded she explain a specific clause in the eviction notice, she quoted the relevant section of the municipal code verbatim, leaving him momentarily speechless. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs of disbelief, and even the seasoned attorney sitting nearby couldn't help but lean forward, intrigued by this unassuming woman who seemed to possess an uncanny knowledge of the law. By the time the first hour of the hearing drew to a close, it was clear that Judge Hawthorne's initial impression of Clara was wrong, or at least incomplete. Far from being the timid, uninformed defendant he'd assumed she was, Clara exuded a quiet strength that commanded attention. And while the judge hadn't yet realized it, his attempts to humiliate her were only setting the stage for a much bigger revelation, one that would turn the entire case and his perception of her on its head. The courtroom fell into an uneasy silence as Clara's calm response echoed through the space. Judge Hawthorne, who had been so confident in his ability to intimidate her, now found himself momentarily at a loss for words. He adjusted his glasses, peering down at her with renewed curiosity, and perhaps a touch of suspicion. "Well, Ms. Bennett," he said after a pause, his tone less biting but still laced with skepticism, "it seems you've done your homework. But knowing a few legal terms doesn't make you a lawyer." Clara nodded politely, her expression unchanged. She didn't argue or try to defend herself further. Instead, she simply waited, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the podium. The judge, however, wasn't ready to let her off the hook just yet. Leaning forward slightly, he decided to push harder. "Let's see how far that knowledge goes," he remarked, almost to himself. Then, raising his voice, he asked, "Can you explain to this court why you believe the eviction notice violates your rights? And please spare us the theatrics." The gallery leaned in, eager to hear what Clara would say next. Her hesitation lasted only a moment before she began speaking again, her voice steady and measured. "Your Honor, the eviction notice issued against me is based on a zoning violation claim. However, according to Section 14B of the Municipal Housing Code, such claims require a formal inspection report filed no later than 30 days prior to the issuance of any notice. No such report exists in my case." A murmur rippled through the spectators, and even the opposing counsel shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Judge Hawthorne frowned, flipping through the documents in front of him. "That's interesting," he admitted reluctantly, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "But even if that's true, Ms. Bennett, it doesn't prove malicious intent. Zoning disputes happen all the time." Clara didn't miss a beat. "True, Your Honor, but there's more." She reached into her notebook once again, pulling out a photocopy of a letter addressed to the town council. This correspondence shows that the developer attempted to expedite the demolition permit without following proper procedures. They cited emergency circumstances, which were later proven false by independent inspectors. The judge stared at the document she handed over, his brow furrowing deeper. For the first time since the hearing began, he seemed genuinely unsure of how to proceed. Still, his pride wouldn't allow him to admit defeat. Not yet. Clearing his throat, he turned his attention back to Clara. "And where did you obtain these documents?" he asked pointedly, clearly hoping to catch her in some procedural misstep. "I requested them under the Freedom of Information Act," Clara replied without hesitation. "It took several weeks and multiple appeals, but eventually, I received everything I needed to build my case." Her answer was matter-of-fact, leaving no room for doubt about her diligence or her determination. By now, the atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted dramatically. What had started as a routine eviction hearing was rapidly turning into something far more compelling. Spectators whispered among themselves, marveling at Clara's composure and apparent expertise. Even the bailiff, usually stoic and unflappable, couldn't hide his fascination as he glanced repeatedly between Clara and the increasingly flustered judge. Judge Hawthorne, sensing the tide turning against him, decided to change tactics. Instead of focusing solely on Clara's arguments, he shifted his attention to undermining her credibility. "Ms. Bennett," he said, leaning back in his chair with a sly smile, "you seem remarkably well prepared for someone who claims not to be a practicing attorney. Are you sure you haven't had professional help with this case?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. It was a classic move, a veiled accusation meant to cast doubt on her integrity. But Clara didn't rise to the bait. Instead, she met the judge's gaze squarely, her eyes steady and unwavering. "I assure you, Your Honor, I prepared this case entirely on my own. My resources may be limited, but my understanding of the law is not." Her reply drew another round of murmurs from the crowd. Some nodded approvingly, while others exchanged incredulous looks. How could someone so seemingly ordinary possess such a deep grasp of complex legal principles? It was a question that lingered in everyone's mind, including Judge Hawthorne's. Determined to regain control, the judge launched into another line of questioning, this time targeting the technicalities of Clara's argument. "Even if we accept your interpretation of the zoning laws," he said, tapping his pen against the bench, "you still haven't addressed the issue of standing. Why should this court grant you relief when other tenants in similar situations have chosen not to contest their evictions?" Clara tilted her head slightly, considering the question. "Your Honor," she began, her tone thoughtful, "the reason others haven't challenged their evictions isn't because they don't care. It's because they lack the resources or confidence to do so. I'm here today not just for myself, but for everyone who has been wrongfully displaced by this developer's actions. If the law allows injustice to go unchecked, then it fails to serve its purpose." Her words struck a chord, resonating deeply with those in attendance. Several people in the gallery nodded emphatically, while others exchanged glances filled with newfound respect. Even the seasoned attorney watching from the sidelines found himself impressed by her eloquence and conviction. Judge Hawthorne, however, remained unmoved, at least outwardly. "Well said, Ms. Bennett," he muttered dryly, though his expression betrayed a flicker of unease. He glanced down at his notes, searching for another angle of attack. But the more he questioned her, the clearer it became that Clara was not just holding her own, she was excelling. Each answer she gave was precise, each argument she presented backed by solid evidence. It was as if she had anticipated every possible challenge and come prepared with a counter-argument. As the hearing dragged on, the judge's frustration became increasingly evident. His earlier smugness had given way to irritation, and his questions grew sharper, more pointed. Yet Clara remained unfazed, responding to each one with the same quiet confidence that had characterized her performance from the start. By the time the session neared its conclusion, it was obvious to everyone in the room that this was no ordinary defendant. This was someone who understood the intricacies of the law better than most professionals, and who refused to back down, no matter the odds. When the judge finally called for a recess, the courtroom erupted into hushed conversations. People gathered in small groups discussing what they had just witnessed. Some praised Clara's courage and intelligence, while others speculated about her background. How had she acquired such knowledge? Who was she really? These questions swirled in the air, unanswered but tantalizing, leaving everyone eager to see what would happen next. When the recess ended and the courtroom reconvened, the atmosphere was electric. The whispers that had filled the room during the break now gave way to an expectant silence as Clara stepped back to the podium. Judge Hawthorne, who had used the time to review her evidence more closely, seemed torn between skepticism and reluctant admiration. His earlier mockery had softened, replaced by a guarded curiosity, but he wasn't about to let his guard down completely. Not yet. "Ms. Bennett," he began, his tone measured but still tinged with challenge, "you've presented some intriguing points so far. However, none of this proves that the eviction notice is invalid or that the developer acted in bad faith. Can you provide any concrete proof of misconduct?" Clara didn't hesitate. She reached into her notebook once again, this time pulling out a series of documents bound together with paper clips. As she laid them on the table, the opposing counsel shifted uncomfortably in his seat. It was clear from their reactions that they recognized what those documents were, and they weren't happy about it. "These are copies of correspondence between the developer and local officials," Clara explained, her voice steady and clear. "They show that the developer attempted to bribe members of the zoning board to expedite the demolition permits without proper inspections. These emails were obtained through a public records request." The room erupted into murmurs. Bribery. Allegations were serious business, and if true, they could derail the entire case against Clara. Judge Hawthorne's eyes narrowed as he scanned the documents handed to him by the bailiff. Even the opposing counsel leaned forward anxiously, clearly unprepared for this development. "This is quite damning," the judge admitted after a long pause, his voice quieter than before. He glanced at the developer's lawyer, who fumbled for words. "Do you have anything to say regarding these allegations?" he asked sharply. The lawyer stammered, trying to deflect. "Your Honor, these documents are taken out of context. They don't prove anything conclusive. They speak for themselves," Clara interrupted calmly, cutting off the lawyer mid-sentence. Her interruption drew gasps from the gallery. Interrupting opposing counsel in court was bold, especially for someone representing themselves, but Clara didn't care. She turned back to the judge, her expression firm. "If you examine the timestamps and content of these emails, Your Honor, you'll see a pattern of unethical behavior. The developer pressured officials to bypass standard procedures, knowing full well that their claims of emergency circumstances were false." Judge Hawthorne studied the documents again, his brow furrowed in concentration. For the first time, his usual air of superiority faltered. Here was a woman who not only understood the law, but also knew how to navigate its complexities with precision. He couldn't dismiss her arguments as amateurish anymore. They were too well researched, too meticulously presented. But Clara wasn't done yet. She had one final piece of evidence up her sleeve, and she saved it for the moment when all eyes were on her. Reaching into her bag, she pulled out a thick folder labeled Exhibit C. Opening it, she revealed photographs of the property in question, images showing that the building was structurally sound and posed no immediate danger to residents. Next to the photos were inspection reports conducted by independent engineers, all confirming that the claims made by the developer were baseless. "These reports contradict everything the developer has argued," Clara said, her voice rising, slightly with conviction. "They claim my home is unsafe and must be demolished immediately. Yet these experts found no structural issues whatsoever. Why? Because the real reason for the eviction isn't safety, it's profit. The developer wants to demolish our homes to build luxury condos, and they're willing to break the law to do it." The gallery erupted into murmurs once again, this time louder and more animated. People exchanged glances, nodding in agreement as Clara laid out her case. Even the bailiff, who had remained stoic throughout the hearing, looked visibly moved. The weight of her argument was undeniable. The developer's actions weren't just legally questionable, they were morally wrong. Judge Hawthorne sat back in his chair, visibly shaken. He glanced at the opposing counsel, who was now sweating profusely under the weight of Clara's revelations. Then, turning his attention back to Clara, he asked, "How did you manage to gather all of this information? Most people wouldn't know where to start." Clara hesitated for the first time since the hearing began. She took a deep breath, collecting her thoughts before responding. "I spent months researching, filing requests, and reaching out to experts. I attended town hall meetings, read every piece of legislation related to housing laws, and documented everything I found. It wasn't easy," she admitted, her voice softening slightly. "But I knew I couldn't give up, not when so much was at stake." Her honesty struck a chord with everyone in the room. Gone was the image of the timid, unassuming woman who had walked into the courtroom hours earlier. In her place stood someone entirely different, a legal strategist, a fighter, and above all, a protector of justice. Judge Hawthorne stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke. "Ms. Bennett, you've certainly given us a lot to consider. I'll need time to review these documents thoroughly and consult with both parties before making a decision." With that, he banged his gavel, signaling the end of the session. As the courtroom emptied, Clara gathered her belongings, her movements deliberate and unhurried. Several spectators approached her, offering words of encouragement and praise. One elderly woman clasped her hands tightly, tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "You're giving us hope." Clara smiled gently, touched by the gesture. "This isn't just about me," she replied softly. "It's about standing up for what's right, even when it feels impossible." Meanwhile, Judge Hawthorne retreated to his chambers, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had underestimated Clara, and that his initial attempts to humiliate her had backfired spectacularly. What started as a routine eviction hearing had turned into something far greater, a lesson in humility and respect for the power of determination. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered, eager to speak with Clara. Word of her performance had spread quickly, drawing attention from local media outlets. Cameras flashed as she stepped onto the courthouse steps, shielding her face with her hand. "No comment," she said simply, walking past the crowd and disappearing into the afternoon sunlight. Though the verdict was still pending, one thing was certain. Clara Bennett had already won something far more valuable than a legal victory. She had earned the respect of everyone in that courtroom, including the man who had tried so hard to tear her down. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the small town, it was clear that her story was only beginning. The next morning, the courthouse buzzed with anticipation. News of Clara Bennett's performance had spread like wildfire, and a larger crowd than usual gathered inside, eager to witness the outcome of the case. Reporters lined the back rows, notebooks in hand, while curious onlookers whispered among themselves about the quiet crusader who had taken on a powerful developer and seemed to be winning. Even Judge Hawthorne appeared different as he entered the courtroom, his usual swagger replaced by a more subdued demeanor. Clara arrived shortly before proceedings were set to begin, carrying the same tattered notebook she'd brought the day before. Her calmness was striking. There was no trace of nervousness or hesitation in her step as she took her place at the podium. She glanced briefly at the spectators, her eyes scanning the room, but her focus quickly returned to the task. Ahead, Judge Hawthorne, seated above her, cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses, signaling the start of what promised to be a pivotal session. "Ms. Bennett," he began, his tone noticeably softer than it had been the previous day. "Before we proceed, I must commend you for the thoroughness of your presentation thus far. However, I have some questions regarding the evidence you've submitted." He paused, flipping through the stack of documents in front of him. "Specifically, these emails and inspection reports. How did you verify their authenticity?" Clara nodded, as if she'd expected the question. "Your Honor, each document was obtained legally through public records requests or provided directly by independent experts. The emails include metadata confirming their origins, and the inspection reports bear the signatures and credentials of licensed engineers. If necessary, I can provide affidavits from the authors attesting to their validity." Her response left little room for doubt. Judge Hawthorne studied her for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "Very well," he said finally. "But even assuming these documents are genuine, proving misconduct requires more than circumstantial evidence. Can you demonstrate intent on the part of the developer?" It was a critical question, one that could make or break her case. Clara didn't flinch. Instead, she reached into her notebook and pulled out another set of papers. This time they were financial records detailing the developer's recent transactions. "These documents show payments made to certain zoning officials shortly before the eviction notices were issued," she explained. "While I understand correlation does not equal causation, when combined with the emails and falsified permits, it paints a clear picture of deliberate wrongdoing." The opposing counsel stood abruptly, his face flushed with frustration. "Objection, Your Honor," he exclaimed. "These allegations are baseless and inflammatory. My client has always operated within the bounds of the law." Judge Hawthorne raised a hand to silence him. "Counselor, let Ms. Bennett finish her argument." His tone carried an edge of authority, one that hadn't been present earlier in the trial. The lawyer sank back into his seat, visibly irritated, but unable to counter Clara's logic. Clara continued, her voice steady and commanding. "Your Honor, this isn't just about individual acts, it's about a pattern of behavior designed to exploit loopholes and push vulnerable people out of their homes. The developer knew exactly what they were doing, and they counted on us being too intimidated or too uninformed to fight back." Her words resonated deeply with those in attendance. Many of the spectators nodded in agreement, some even murmuring words of encouragement. One elderly man in the front row whispered loudly, "Enough for others to hear. She's speaking the truth. We've seen it happen too many times. Judge Hawthorne leaned forward, resting his chin on his hands. There was a weightiness to his posture now, as though he understood the gravity of the situation. After a long pause, he addressed Clara directly. Ms. Bennett, I'm curious. Why didn't you hire an attorney to handle this case? Surely someone with your level of expertise could have secured representation easily. For the first time since the hearing began, Clara hesitated. She looked down at her notebook, her fingers tracing the worn cover. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer, tinged with emotion. I chose to represent myself because this case is personal to me. I've lived in that neighborhood for years. It's my home. Hiring a lawyer would have felt like handing over a piece of my life to someone else. And besides, she paused, raising her gaze to meet the judge's. Not everyone has access to legal resources. I wanted to show that standing up for yourself doesn't require wealth or connections. It requires courage and a willingness to learn. Her answer hung in the air, leaving a profound impact on everyone present. Even Judge Hawthorne seemed affected, his stern expression softening slightly. For a man accustomed to wielding power in the courtroom, seeing someone so resolute and self-reliant was humbling. He sat back in his chair, contemplating her words. After several moments of silence, the judge turned to the opposing counsel. Do you have any rebuttal to Ms. Bennett's claims? He asked pointedly. The lawyer stood again, though this time less confidently. Your Honor, while Ms. Bennett has presented compelling arguments, the burden of proof remains on her. Without direct testimony from the alleged bribed officials, we cannot conclusively establish intent. Judge Hawthorne nodded slowly. A fair point. However, given the volume and specificity of the evidence submitted, I find it difficult to dismiss Ms. Bennett's allegations outright. He turned back to Clara. Is there anyone willing to testify on your behalf regarding these matters? Clara shook her head. Unfortunately, no. Many of the officials involved have either resigned or refused to cooperate, but I believe the documents speak for themselves. The judge sighed, rubbing his temples. It was clear he was grappling with a decision that would carry significant implications, not just for this case, but for how such disputes were handled moving forward. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. Ms. Bennett, based on the evidence presented, I am inclined to rule in your favor. The eviction notice appears to violate multiple statutes, and the allegations of misconduct warrant further investigation. I will issue a temporary injunction halting the demolition process until a full review can be conducted. Additionally, I'll refer this matter to the district attorney's office for potential criminal charges against the developer. Gasps rippled through the gallery as the reality of the ruling sank in. Clara remained composed, though a faint smile played at the corners of her lips. She thanked the judge quietly, her gratitude evident in her tone. Meanwhile, the opposing counsel slumped in defeat, knowing the tide had turned irrevocably against his client. As the gavel fell and the courtroom erupted into applause, Judge Hawthorne called Clara back to the stand. Before we adjourn, he said, his voice carrying an uncharacteristic warmth, I want to apologize for my behavior yesterday. I allowed my assumptions to cloud my judgment, and for that I am truly sorry. You've demonstrated remarkable skill and integrity, Ms. Bennett. If you ever decide to return to practicing law, I would personally recommend you without hesitation. Clara bowed her head graciously. Thank you, Your Honor. But my fight isn't about titles or recognition. It's about ensuring justice for those who can't fight for themselves. That's why I'll continue doing what I do, whether in a courtroom or elsewhere. With that, she stepped away from the podium, disappearing into the throng of supporters waiting to congratulate her. As she exited the courthouse, cameras flashing, and reporters shouting questions, Clara kept her focus forward. She knew the battle wasn't entirely over. The developer might appeal, and the fight for accountability would take time, but she also knew she had struck a blow against injustice. And for now, that was enough. In the days that followed, news of Clara's victory spread far beyond the small town. Local newspapers hailed her as a hero, praising her resilience and intellect. Judge Hawthorne, meanwhile, became known not only for his fairness, but also for his newfound humility. The courtroom spectacle had changed both of them, and countless others inspired by Clara's quiet strength. Though she returned to her simple life, Clara's story served as a reminder that true power lies not in titles or appearances, but in the courage to stand up for what's right, even when the odds seem insurmountable. And as she walked home under the golden afternoon sun, she couldn't help but feel a sense of peace, knowing she had made a difference, not just for herself, but for everyone who believed in justice. In the weeks following the hearing, Clara Bennett's life transformed in ways she hadn't anticipated. The small-town courthouse case that had started as a personal fight to save her home became a symbol of hope for countless others facing similar struggles. News outlets continued to cover her story, highlighting not only her legal acumen but also her quiet determination and humility. People from neighboring towns, and even other states, began reaching out to her, seeking advice on how to challenge unfair evictions, zoning disputes, and predatory development practices. Clara handled these inquiries with the same patience and care she had shown during her own battle. She set aside time each evening to answer letters and emails, sharing resources, offering guidance, and encouraging others to stand up for their rights. Though she insisted she wasn't a lawyer anymore, her ability to explain complex legal concepts in simple terms made her an invaluable resource for those who felt powerless against larger forces. Meanwhile, Judge Richard Hawthorne found himself reflecting deeply on the events of the trial. For years he had prided himself on his authority and intellect, often dismissing defendants like Clara as ill-equipped or unworthy of serious consideration. But witnessing her poise, preparation, and moral clarity forced him to confront his biases. He realized that his courtroom demeanor had sometimes crossed the line from firmness into cruelty, a truth that weighed heavily on him. Determined to change, Hawthorne began adjusting his approach. He took extra care to ensure every person appearing before him felt heard and respected, regardless of their background or level of education. When unrepresented defendants stumbled over legal jargon, he offered explanations rather than ridicule. And when cases involving vulnerable communities arose, he went out of his way to investigate thoroughly, ensuring fairness prevailed. His transformation didn't go unnoticed. Attorneys and litigants alike remarked on his newfound empathy and dedication to justice. Back in Clara's neighborhood, the temporary injunction issued by the judge provided much-needed relief. The looming threat of demolition was paused indefinitely, allowing residents to breathe easier. However, Clara knew the victory was fragile. Developers rarely backed down without a fight, and this one was no exception. Rumors circulated that they were preparing an appeal, determined to overturn the ruling. But Clara refused to let fear dictate her actions. Instead, she rallied her neighbors, organizing meetings to discuss strategies for protecting their community in the long term. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting soft orange hues across the sky, Clara stood at the center of a crowded living room. Dozens of neighbors had gathered, eager to hear her thoughts on what came next. "We've won a battle," she said, her voice steady yet warm. "But the war isn't over. If we want to keep our homes safe, we need to stay united. Together, we're stronger than any corporation." Her words inspired action. Neighbors formed committees to monitor local government decisions, attend town hall meetings, and document any suspicious activities related to the developer. They also reached out to advocacy groups specializing in housing rights, forming alliances that amplified their voices. Clara played a key role in coordinating these efforts, leveraging her growing network of contacts to secure pro bono legal assistance for families targeted by similar schemes. As the months passed, the ripple effects of Clara's case extended far beyond her immediate community. Local officials, wary of the scrutiny brought on by the scandal, tightened regulations surrounding zoning permits and demolition orders. Independent inspectors were required to conduct thorough assessments before any notices could be issued, reducing opportunities for corruption. Even state legislators took notice, introducing bills aimed at increasing transparency and accountability in real estate development projects. Despite the progress, Clara remained grounded. She declined multiple offers to speak at conferences or appear on television shows, preferring instead to focus on grassroots efforts. Her modest lifestyle hadn't changed. She still lived in the same cozy house, tended her garden daily, and spent hours poring over legal texts in her free time. Yet there was a subtle shift in her demeanor. A quiet confidence radiated from her now, born not of arrogance but of purpose. Judge Hawthorne, too, experienced a profound shift in perspective. Inspired by Clara's example, he initiated a series of workshops designed to educate citizens about their legal rights. These sessions, held monthly at the courthouse, attracted diverse audiences, from elderly homeowners to young activists passionate about social justice. Hawthorne often invited guest speakers, including former judges, lawyers, and community leaders, to share insights and experiences. At one such event, he publicly acknowledged Clara's influence on his journey toward becoming a better jurist. "Owe a debt of gratitude to Ms. Bennett," he admitted during a panel discussion. "She reminded me why I became a judge in the first place. To serve justice, not my ego. Her courage and integrity challenged me to reevaluate my priorities and strive for fairness in all aspects of my work." Though Clara avoided the spotlight, word of Hawthorne's remarks eventually reached her. She smiled quietly upon hearing them, touched by his sincerity. It wasn't vindication she sought, it was understanding. Knowing that her actions had sparked meaningful change, both within the system and among individuals, filled her with a deep sense of fulfillment. By the end of the year, the developer's appeal failed spectacularly. Their attempts to discredit Clara's evidence fell flat in the face of overwhelming proof of misconduct. Facing mounting pressure from regulators and public outrage, the company abandoned its plans entirely, choosing instead to sell off the disputed properties at fair market prices. Many of the original tenants, including Clara, opted to purchase their homes outright, securing their futures in the neighborhood they loved. The final chapter of the saga unfolded on a crisp winter morning, when the entire community gathered for a celebration. Tables laden with homemade dishes stretched across the street, while children laughed and played amidst colorful decorations. Clara stood at the heart of it all, surrounded by friends and neighbors who had become family over the course of their shared struggle. As speeches gave way to music and dancing, Clara slipped away briefly, retreating to her porch to watch the festivities unfold. Wrapped in a thick sweater, she gazed out at the scene with a contented smile. The road ahead wouldn't always be easy. There would undoubtedly be new challenges, but for now peace reigned. And in that moment, she allowed herself to savor the hard-earned victory, knowing that together they had proven that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things. For Clara, the true reward lay not in accolades or recognition, but in the knowledge that she had made a difference, not just for herself, but for everyone who believed in the power of unity and justice. As fireworks lit up the night sky, signaling the start of a brighter future, she felt a profound sense of gratitude for her community, for the lessons learned, and for the enduring strength of the human spirit. Months turned into a year, and the small town where Clara Bennett lived began to feel different, lighter, more hopeful. The victory against the developer wasn't just a legal triumph. It sparked something deeper within the community. People, who had once felt powerless, now believed in their ability to stand up for themselves. Neighbors talked openly about issues affecting their streets, from potholes that needed fixing to abandoned lots that could be transformed into gardens. Clara's quiet leadership inspired others to take initiative, creating a ripple effect of positive change. Clara herself became a fixture at community meetings, though she rarely sought the spotlight. She preferred listening to people's concerns, offering advice when asked, and gently nudging them toward solutions. Her presence alone seemed to empower those around her. When someone hesitated to speak up, Clara would smile encouragingly and say, "Your voice matters. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." It was a simple phrase, but it carried immense weight, especially coming from someone who had faced down one of the most powerful developers in the state. The neighborhood began to transform, not just legally or politically, but socially. Longtime residents reconnected with each other, forming bonds stronger than ever before. Newcomers were welcomed warmly, invited to join potlucks and block parties. Children played freely on sidewalks lined with flower pots planted by volunteers. Even the local businesses thrived as foot traffic increased, thanks to renewed interest in the revitalized area. What had once been a tight-knit but struggling community blossomed into a vibrant example of resilience and unity. Meanwhile, Judge E. Richard Hawthorne continued his efforts to reform the way justice was served in his courtroom. His workshops gained popularity, drawing participants from neighboring counties and even other states. Lawyers praised him for fostering greater transparency, while defendants expressed gratitude for his patience and fairness. Though he never publicly mentioned Clara again after the panel discussion, those close to him noticed how often he referenced a recent case that had profoundly impacted his perspective. One day, during a particularly lively workshop, a young woman approached Hawthorne after the session ended. She introduced herself as Sarah, a single mother fighting to keep her apartment after receiving an unjust eviction notice. Her story mirrored Clara's in many ways, except Sarah lacked the legal knowledge to navigate the system on her own. With tears in her eyes, she thanked the judge for his guidance and admitted, "I didn't think anyone cared about people like me." Hawthorne placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "People like you are why we're here," he said firmly. "Don't give up. You have rights, and there are resources to help you fight for them." He then referred her to a nonprofit organization, specializing in tenant advocacy, a group Clara had recommended to him months earlier. Watching Sarah leave with renewed determination, Hawthorne felt a swell of pride, not for himself, but for the collective effort making such moments possible. Back on. In Clara's world, life settled into a comfortable rhythm. She continued helping neighbors prepare for hearings, draft letters to officials, and organize petitions. But she also carved out time for herself, rediscovering hobbies she'd neglected during the chaos of the trial. On weekends, she visited the library, borrowing stacks of books on history, philosophy, and art. She took long walks through the park, pausing to sketch scenes of trees swaying in the breeze or children chasing kites. These small joys reminded her of the beauty and simplicity, the same beauty she fought so hard to preserve. One crisp autumn afternoon, as golden leaves blanketed the ground, Clara received an unexpected visitor. A man dressed in a neatly pressed suit stood at her door holding a leather briefcase. He introduced himself as Gregory Lane, a senior partner at one of the country's most prestigious law firms. "Ms. Bennett," he began, his tone respectful, "I've heard remarkable things about your work. My firm is currently handling several cases involving housing rights, and we believe your expertise could make a significant difference." Clara listened politely, shaking her head before he finished. "Thank you for the offer, Mr. Lane, but I'm content where I am. This is my home and my place is here with my neighbors." Lane smiled, clearly impressed by her conviction. "I understand completely. Still, if you ever change your mind, please know that opportunities await. Your skills deserve recognition beyond this town." After he left, Clara sat on her porch reflecting on the conversation. Recognition wasn't what drove her. It never had been. What mattered most was staying true to her values and using her knowledge to uplift others. Fame and fortune held little appeal compared to the satisfaction of seeing her community thrive. As winter approached, the town prepared for its annual holiday festival. Streets glittered with twinkling lights, and storefront windows displayed festive decorations. Clara joined a group of volunteers decorating the central square, hanging wreaths and stringing garlands. Laughter filled the air as friends worked side by side, sharing stories and hot cocoa. For the first time in years, Clara felt truly at peace. On the night of the festival, crowds gathered to celebrate. Music played, food stalls bustled with activity, and children marveled at the arrival of Santa Claus atop a fire truck. Amidst the festivities, Mayor Thompson, an ally who had supported Clara throughout the trial, took the stage to deliver a speech. "Tonight," he began, his voice warm and heartfelt, "we celebrate not only the season, but also the spirit of our community. Over the past year, we faced challenges that tested us, but together we emerged stronger. None of this would have been possible without the courage and dedication of individuals like Clara Bennett. The crowd erupted into applause as Clara stepped forward, visibly surprised by the acknowledgement. She waved modestly, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "I didn't do anything special," she insisted when handed the microphone. "We all did this, together." Her humility only endeared her further to the townsfolk. As fireworks lit up the sky, painting bursts of color across the stars, Clara stood quietly among her neighbors, feeling a profound sense of belonging. This was her legacy, not fame or accolades, but the love and trust of a community united by shared struggles and triumphs. In the years that followed, Clara's story spread far and wide, inspiring countless others to stand up for their rights. Judges like Hawthorne adopted fairer practices, ensuring justice reached even the most marginalized voices. Developers learned that exploiting communities came at a cost, not just financially, but morally. And neighborhoods everywhere discovered the power of unity, proving that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things when they worked together. Though Clara never sought recognition, her name became synonymous with quiet strength and unwavering resolve. To some, she was a hero. To others, a mentor or friend. But to herself, she remained simply Clara, a woman who chose to live simply, love deeply, and fight tirelessly for what was right. And in doing so, she left behind a legacy that would endure for generations to come.